everyone a really good evening and welcome to the Southport Bijou Cinema for today's screening. I'm afraid that Robert Redford can't make it tonight, so I'm afraid you've got to put up with me as the warm-up act. So what's going to happen is I'm Ed Procter and I'm CEO of an independent press regulator, IMPRESS, and I'm going to say a few words about journalism and how IMPRESS regulates, in particular, investigative journalism, as a sort of introduction to tonight's film. So I'm going to speak for probably about 15 minutes or so, and then if you've got any questions, I'm happy to take some questions, and then I think we're going to have a very short break, and the film is going to start at around about 8:30, if that's okay. Can I just check everyone can hear me okay? Yes. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a bit of a spoiler alert. I mean, obviously, All the President's Men is a film about one of the greatest pieces of investigative journalism that's ever reported. But what is investigative journalism and why does it matter? And how does my organisation, IMPRESS, support high-quality investigative reporting? That's what I want to talk to you today. So journalism plays a crucial role in society. Every day, journalists report significant events, controversies, they expose wrongdoing, they satirise, they amuse, and they entertain. But with such power comes huge responsibility. And my organisation, IMPRESS, aims to ensure that journalists behave responsibly while protecting their role to investigate and report freely. And that's why we've been certified as the only independent regulator of the press in the UK. And that's what we're about. So we set standards and we set guidance for journalists. We investigate complaints into sort of poor press conduct. And we also help resolve legal disputes between members of the public and newspapers and online websites. So we regulate 136 independent newspapers and websites across the UK and internationally, including the Southport Reporter, I should add. And we also specialise in regulating what I call niche investigative websites. And these are the kind of websites that you may not have heard of, but they're also the websites that generate many of the news stories that get picked up by some of the mainstream press. So maybe you haven't heard of Byline, you may not have heard of Climate Change News, or The Ferret, which is one of the biggest investigative journalism platforms in Scotland, or Bellingcat, or The New Internationalist. I'll tell you a little bit more about their work. But their stories, as I said, are often picked up by the mainstream press. And for various reasons, you find that some of the national press, I mean particularly in the 1960s and the 70s, the Sunday Times in particular, under the editorship of Harry Evans, had a huge investigative journalism operation. But for various reasons, a lot of the national press have cut back on investigative journalism. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But IMPRESS as an organisation, we were formed 5 years ago in response to the Leveson inquiry. I don't know if you sort of recall that, which was called by the Prime Minister of the time then, David Cameron, in response to public outrage at the hacking of the phone of murdered schoolgirl Millie Dowler. So the Leveson inquiry, I'll just say a little bit about the Leveson inquiry. It was the 7th government commissioned independent inquiry into the press since the Second World War. So there have been a number of these. It reported in November 2012 and it looked at the culture, practices and ethics of the British press. So what did Leveson find? First of all, he found that there was an unhealthy relationship between politicians and the press. That the press was meant to be holding politicians to account, but actually the press and politicians were perhaps working too closely hand in hand for the good of democracy. Leveson also found that the industry-backed regulator, the Press Complaints Commission, was neither effective and independent, and that it didn't protect the public. It was designed largely to protect the commercial interests of the industry. But more seriously, what he found was that at times the behaviour of the press in the UK had been outrageous, and that was the word he used. He said press behaviour had been outrageous. And he cited to many examples. There are over more than 4,000 cases of phone hacking that are still going through the courts nearly 10 years on. Hacking the voicemail messages of the victims of terrorist attacks and serious crime, as well as hacking the voicemail messages of the royal family and celebrities such as Hugh Grant, J.K. Rowling, Sienna Miller, and also a practice of what's known as blagging, which is where the press or representative of the press would phone up and pretend to be someone else to get private medical records or financial records from banks and hospitals. And Gordon Brown, who was the Prime Minister of the last sort of 3 governments, he was obviously the most sort of famous victim, and he certainly believed that all of the medical information about his son, who had quite a serious disability, was exposed through the practice of blagging. So many of the examples of press abuse uncovered by the Leveson inquiry were examples of newspapers using the techniques of investigative journalism against the public and not for the public. Over £500 million has been paid out in compensation by 2 newspaper groups. That's News UK, who published the News of the World, the Sun on Sunday, and also the Reach, which is the Mirror group, the Sunday Mirror and the Daily Mirror. So they paid out £500 million over the last several years to settle legal claims against members of the public in phone hacking cases, and that figure is expected to rise to over £1 billion in the next few years. There are still hundreds of these cases going through the courts, but you don't read about them in the press. I wonder why that is. So the idea of public interest lies at the heart of investigative journalism. In his survival guide to investigative journalism, former head of investigations at The Guardian and David Lee is also a board member of IMPRESS, my organisation. He defined investigative journalism as the daily supply of public interest truths about the world that would otherwise be hidden. So this idea of public interest is key to IMPRESS's model of regulation, and I want to talk a little bit more about what we mean by public interest. So a public interest means that the public has a legitimate stake in a story because of the contribution it makes to a matter of importance to society. So such matters might include the reporting of serious incompetence or unethical behaviour that affects the public. So looking at areas like the administration of government or justice, public health and safety, prevention and detection of crime, and national security. So public interest is not what interests the public, it's not what the public is curious about. It is what the public has a stake in as citizens of a democratic society. So that's the IMPRESS definition of the public interest. And what I want to do now is to kind of illustrate that public interest point by just briefly talking about three I think, of some of the finest examples of investigative journalism that we've seen in the UK over the last sort of 50 years or so. So my first example goes back to the 1960s, and remember I mentioned Harry Evans, who was a campaigning journalist and editor of the Sunday Times, who fell out with Rupert Murdoch. I've spoken to Harry about this, and he tells me that Murdoch was trying to interfere with the stories that he wrote in the paper, and he wasn't having any of that. So he sort of walked off to New York. So he's a very principled man. And what he did, he exposed the effects of thalidomide. So he helped to establish the liability of distillers, who were the company that produced and marketed the thalidomide drug in Britain in the late 50s and the early 1960s. So thalidomide was a drug that was given to pregnant women who suffered from morning sickness, and it was linked to 10,000 cases of birth deformities during a sort of 2-3 year period, of which around 40% of the babies that were born died at birth or very closely after birth. So a huge issue of public interest. And the investigation helped to remove thalidomide from the UK market, which prevented future cases. It also helped to set up a compensation fund for those who survived, and the survivors of thalidomide are now all in their kind of late 50s and sort of early mid-60s. So, you know, a really important piece of landmark investigative journalism. My next example is a more recent one. We move forward to the sort of 2000s, and it's a sporting example. It's the Irish journalist David Walsh, who lifted the lid on the doping programme by Lance Armstrong and the US Postal Service cycling team. He exposed blatant cheating that was against the rules of sport and which deprived clean athletes of moments of glory that they could never win back. So the investigation led to Lance Armstrong being stripped of his record 7 Tour de France titles. He was banned for life from the sport. And what did it do? It led to a strengthening of the anti-doping testing rules across the world and to major reform of the governing body for cycling, the UCI. So again, you can really see the impact that investigative journalism can have. And the last example is of real close interest to IMPRESS because it involves one of the publishers that we regulate, which is a publication called Bellingcat. And this is a niche investigative journalism website that blew the whistle on the identity of the Russian tourists who were photographed in Salisbury on the day of the Novichok poisonings. If you remember, that was in the story in 2018. So what Bellingcat were able to do was they were able to identify the tourists, not as tourists, but as Russian intelligence officers with close links to President Putin. So the investigation shed new light on Russian aggression in the UK, and it also helped to silence some of the criticism against the UK government for jumping to premature conclusions about Russian involvement. And the really interesting thing about Bellingcat is the techniques they use are techniques that we could all deploy. They use what's known as open source internet technology. So what they do is they use tools such as satellite images from Google Earth, they use Facebook pages, and they use image matching software to actually be able to pinpoint where almost anything is happening on Earth, and to actually, you know, do some really, really amazing investigative journalism. So all of these cases uncovered public interest truths that involved serious wrongdoing that the public had a legitimate stake in. So what are the rules of investigative journalism? My organisation, IMPRESS, provides details, rules and guidance to help journalists to navigate their way around undertaking investigations. And we have a standards code that we call the IMPRESS Standards Code that we developed in consultation with the public. So we ran sort of focus groups, public surveys, we met with journalists, broadcasters, and the code covers things which are relevant to investigative journalism, things like accuracy, harassment, privacy and protection of journalistic sources. And the basic rule that applies is that it may be okay to break the rules as long as it's in the public interest to do so. So the greater the public interest, the greater the justification for breaking of the rules. So if we take an example of a journalist who's investigating the activities of a criminal gang, if a source provided information about a plot to, say, blow up a public building, it will be possible for the journalist to justify covert filming and surveillance as being in the public interest. Normally that may be an invasion of privacy, but because of the wider public interest concerns, then those sorts of techniques can be justified. But as a safeguard, the IMPRESS rules require journalists to keep notes of any decisions that they make to break the rules in the public interest before they break them. So that means that if we get a complaint, maybe a privacy complaint, that a journalist has overstepped the marks, then we can assess the decision making of the journalist and satisfy ourselves that they acted responsibly in weighing up their competing obligations. However, some rules do not carry a public interest exemption. So, you can't ever publish inaccurate or false information, and that's in the wider public interest. Intimidation and violence is never condoned within our rules. The failure to protect the anonymity of sources is also a crucial given. And also there's reporting on some aspects of criminal proceedings, such as the naming of minors or victims of sexual offences or assaults, which again can never be in the public interest. But a big problem for investigative journalism is that it's very expensive. It can be legally quite risky too, particularly when exposing the wrongdoing of rich and powerful individuals, whether it's a Harvey Weinstein type character or whether it's a big oil company like BP. If you're a sort of small niche investigative journalism platform, that you're taking huge legal risks if you're exposing the wrongdoing from these powerful interests. Which is why IMPRESS provides the newspapers and websites that it regulates with a low-cost dispute resolution system. So what this does, it empowers journalists to tell the truth, because they know if they're going to be sued, they get sued through IMPRESS's low-cost arbitration system. And if they lose the case, then it doesn't necessarily mean that they become bankrupt. So what we can't do at IMPRESS is we can't stop newspapers from being sued, but what we can do is create a less costly, fairer, more level playing field for resolving legal claims that are made against journalists. And I just want to finish up now by asking the question, well, what's the future of investigative journalism? I mean, there are some good recent examples of the press undertaking public interest journalism, but its future is certainly under threat and has been under threat for some time. I mean, you'll know that Google and Facebook have hit the advertising revenues of commercial news organisations. And as I said before, investigations are very expensive. They don't generate the same audience, engagement, clicks and revenue as much cheaper to produce celebrity kiss and tell journalism. So that's an issue. And also the government has looked into this. We've recently seen a government review of the sustainability of high quality journalism that was undertaken by Dame Frances Cairncross. And she found that there had been a market failure in public interest journalism. So a lot of the big national papers, the commercial providers, had given up reporting about these kinds of issues because there just wasn't the money, there wasn't the profit in it that there used to be. And this has led to less scrutiny of local and national government. And there's also a worrying trend if you look at Trump in the UK and you look at some of the earlier behaviours of the sort of Johnson government in the UK, of the government sidelining journalists who tell inconvenient truths to avoid proper scrutiny. That's another big risk and issue. So public interest investigative journalism is vital to a healthy and functioning democracy. we all need accurate, responsibly presented news and information to navigate our way around a complex world. So I really hope you enjoy the film this evening. As I said, this is one of I think the greatest pieces of investigative journalism I've ever published. And as you watch it, there are perhaps maybe 4 questions you could think to yourself. You don't need to shout it out loud. Are the characters played by Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford in the film, are they engaged in the process of uncovering truths that would otherwise be hidden? Are they taking all reasonable steps to ensure accuracy? Are they taking steps to protect their sources? And are they acting in the public interest? So hopefully that gives you some food for thought to sort of think through the film. If anyone's got any questions, I'd really be happy to take them now.